Story of America does not begin in 1776. It does not begin with the Pilgrims, and it doesn't even begin with Columbus. Before there was a United States of America, before there were colonies, presidents, or declarations of independence, there was a vast continent stretching from the frozen Arctic to the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It was a land of towering mountain ranges, endless grasslands, dense forests, and winding rivers, and it was not empty. For thousands of years, North America was home to millions of people who built thriving societies, established trade routes spanning hundreds of miles, and developed cultures as diverse as the landscapes that they inhabited. The story of America does not begin in 1776. It does not begin with the Pilgrims, and it doesn't even begin with Columbus. To understand the United States at 250 years old, we must begin much earlier. We must begin with the first Americans. Scientists believe the ancestors of the Indigenous Americans arrived thousands of years ago during what we call the Ice Age. At that time, lower sea levels exposed a land bridge connecting Asia and North America. Generation after generation, families moved across this frozen landscape in search of food and opportunity. Over centuries, they spread throughout the continent. Some settled in the forests, others adapted to the deserts, and some lived along rivers and the coastlines. By the time the Europeans arrived, native peoples had inhabited the Americas for thousands of years. These were not isolated groups struggling to survive. They were already thriving. They were nations, civilizations, communities with rich traditions, languages, governments, and economies. From the Pacific Northwest to the Atlantic coast, hundreds of distinct cultures flourished. Each possessed its own history, its own identity, own understanding of the world. In what is now the American Southwest, the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples constructed remarkable communities from stone and adobe. At places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, they built multiple-story dwellings that still stand today. These settlements demonstrated sophisticated engineering and planning. They also developed irrigation systems that allowed agriculture to flourish in one of North America's harshest environments. Far to the east, another civilization emerged along the Mississippi River. Near present-day St. Louis, a city known today as Cahokia, became one of the largest urban centers in North America. At its height, around 1100 AD, Cahokia may have contained tens of thousands of residents. Massive earthen mounds dominated the landscape, and trade networks connected distant regions. On top of political and religious leaders, governed a society every bit as complex as contemporary European settlements. Yet, when most Americans learn history, Cahokia receives only a brief mention, if mentioned at all. Its story reminds us that advanced civilizations existed in North America centuries before European exploration. Among the most influential indigenous political systems was the Iroquois Confederacy, formed by the Mohawk, Onondaga, Onondaga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora nations. The Confederacy united diverse peoples under a common framework of government, known as the Great Law of Peace. This system emphasized cooperation, diplomacy, and collective decision-making. While historians debate the existence of its influence on the United States Constitution, there is very little question that the indigenous political traditions demonstrated effective forms of self-government long before the American Revolution, the one that we idolize. At a time when Europe was frequently consumed by dynastic wars and political instability, many native nations had developed systems designated to balance power and maintain peace. Long before the arrival of Europeans, and I know I keep saying this, but this is important, North America was connected by vast networks of trade. Copper from the Great Lakes moved south. Shells from the Gulf Coast traveled inland. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains found its way across the great distances using as fire starters. Goods, ideas, technologies, and cultural practices moved between communities. This interconnected world challenges the old misconception that indigenous societies existed in isolation. They did not exist in isolation. They were active participants in complex economic and political networks that spanned over thousands of miles. The continent was alive with movement, with commerce, and alive with innovation. For centuries, Europe knew little about the lands across the Atlantic Ocean. Maps ended where knowledge faded. Legends fill the unknown, yet advances in navigation, shipbuilding, and geography gradually encouraged the exploration of beyond their maps. European kingdoms sought new trade routes to Asia. Spices, silk, and luxury goods promised enormous profits. The Ottoman Empire controlled many traditional land routes. As a result, European monarchs increasingly looked toward the sea. Among them was a mariner from Genoa named Christopher Columbus. Convinced he could reach Asia by sailing west, Columbus secured support from the Spanish crown. In August 1492, he departed with 3 ships. The voyage would change history forever. We all know Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, but do we really know the truth? When Columbus landed in the Caribbean, he believed he had reached islands near Asia. He never understood that he had encountered continents previously unknown to most Europeans. His voyage initiated what historians call the Columbian Exchange. Plants, animals, technology, diseases, and people moved between the eastern and western hemispheres on an unprecedented scale. Some consequences were beneficial. Others were catastrophic. European livestock transformed agriculture. New crops such as corn and potatoes reshaped global diets. Yet, disease proved devastating. We killed a lot of Native Americans with diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses swept through the indigenous populations that possessed no immunity, no vaccines. Entire communities disappeared. Some regions lost the majority of their population within a few generations. It was one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history. Following Columbus, explorers representing Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Spain established a vast empire stretching across the Americas, from Florida down. French explorers followed rivers deep into the continent, and France owned New Orleans port. English settlers established permanent colonies along the Atlantic coast. Each empire sought wealth and influence. Each claimed territory already inhabited by native peoples. Competition among European powers would shape the future of North America for centuries. The continent became a stage upon which empires competed for land, resources, and even power. But the people living there were not merely spectators. Native nations formed alliances with countries claiming they would protect them, resisted encroachment, and adapted to changing circumstances. And they fought back too, and fought to preserve their independence, fought to protect their land. As the 16th century drew to a close, North America stood on the edge of a profound transformation. European ships crossed the Atlantic with increasing frequency. Colonies would soon appear along the coast. New societies would emerge, and old ways of life would be challenged. The collision between indigenous civilizations and European empires would create a new world unlike anything history had previously witnessed. From that collision would eventually emerge 13 colonies. And from those 13 colonies would come a revolution, an idea. And from that revolution would rise a nation that would change the course of human history forever, and still does. But before America could be born, another chapter had to unfold. The story of exploration would become the story of settlement. And the story of settlement would later become the story of a people beginning to think of themselves not as English subjects, but as Americans. The arrivals of Europeans transformed North America forever. What began as exploration soon became colonization. Along the Atlantic coast, small settlements would grow into thriving colonies. New opportunities emerged, but so did conflict, hardship, and division. The foundations of America were being laid, one by one. The voyages of Christopher Columbus opened a door between two worlds. For thousands of years, the peoples of Europe, Africa, and the Americas had developed separately, each following their own paths through history. But after 1492, those worlds became permanently connected. At the dawn of the 16th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Powerful kingdoms were emerging from centuries of conflict. Advances in navigation allowed sailors to venture farther from shore than ever before. Monarchs sought wealth, prestige, and influence in a competitive world. Spain moved first. The discoveries of Columbus brought enormous opportunities for the Spanish crown. Explorers known as conquistadors crossed the Atlantic searching for gold, silver, and glory. Men like Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro conquered vast empires in Central and South America, bringing immense wealth back to Spain. The riches flowing into Europe transformed Spain into one of the world's most powerful nations. Other countries watched closely. They're a little jealous. If Spain could build an empire overseas, why couldn't they? They wanted in on the money. Soon, France, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands joined the race. Now, if you were around for the space race or the Cold War, it was like a race to end nuclear weapons. This is almost how it was. It was a race to get the most colonies, the most land, the most wealth. North America became one of the greatest prizes. Spain was the first European power to establish a lasting presence in what would become the United States. In 1513, Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon landed on the Florida coast. He named the region La Florida. Over the following decades, Spanish explorers traveled across the vast areas of the American South and Southwest. Some searched for legendary cities of gold. Others sought to expand Spain's influence and convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Among the most famous was Hernando de Soto. Beginning in 1539, de Soto led an expedition through much of the southeastern United States. His journey revealed the size and diversity of the continent, but also brought violence and disease to native communities. Spanish settlement followed. In 1565, Spain founded St. Augustine. Today, it remains the oldest continuously occupied European established city in the continental United States. For Spain, North America represented both a strategic frontier and a religious mission. While Spain looked south and west, France focused on the vast interior of the North America continent. French explorers traveled along rivers and lakes seeking a trade opportunities rather than large settlements, and they won the New Orleans port. The fur trade quickly became the foundation of the French colonial ambitions. Beaver pelts were highly valued in Europe, and native nations became critical trading partners. Unlike the Spanish model of conquest and settlement, French traders often dependent on alliances with the indigenous people. Explorers, such as Samuel de Champlain, established lasting relationships with native communities. By the 17th century, France controlled an enormous territory, stretching from Canada down the Mississippi River Valley. Although relatively few French settlers lived there, their influence reached across much of the continent. French explorers mapped rivers, established trading posts, and strengthened alliances that would shape North American politics for generations to come. England entered the race later than Spain and France. Yet, England's colonies would ultimately have the greatest impact on the future of the United States. English leaders saw North America as a land of opportunity. Investors hoped to make fortunes. Religious groups sought freedom. The crown wanted to challenge the growing power of Spain. In 1585, an English settlement was established on Roanoke Island. The colony mysteriously disappeared. Historians debate on what happened to the so-called lost colony. Some say they got killed. Some say they were enslaved by the natives that in that colony had combined with other Native Americans, or they were killed and eaten or whatever. The failure of Roanoke demonstrated just how difficult colonization could be. But England was determined to try again. In 1607, 3 ships arrived in Virginia, carrying approximately 100 settlers. Their destination was a swampy peninsula along the James River. There, they established Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. The colony nearly failed. Diseases had spread quickly. Food was also scarce, and many settlers were unprepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. During the brutal winter of 1609 and 1610, known as the Starving Time, conditions became desperate. Only a fraction of the original colonists survived. Yet, Jamestown endured, and that's what all America is about, is endurance. Its survival depended heavily on assistance from the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, whose people had inhabited the region for centuries. Relations between settlers and the native peoples altered between cooperation and conflict. Over time, tensions increased as English settlements expanded. Jamestown eventually discovered an economic lifeline. A settler named John Rolfe successfully cultivated tobacco. Demand for tobacco exploded in Europe. Crop generated enormous profits and transformed Virginia's economy. What began as a struggling outpost became the foundation of England's colonial ambitions. While Jamestown was founded primarily for economic reasons, another colony emerged for different purposes, and that purpose was religion. In 1620, a group of English separatists known as Pilgrims boarded a ship called the Mayflower, seeking the freedom to practice their faith without interference. They crossed the Atlantic and landed in New England. The first winter was devastating. Cold temperatures, disease, and hunger claimed nearly half the settlers. Once again, survival depended upon indigenous assistance. Members of the Wampanoag people helped teach the colonists how to grow crops and adapt to their new environment. The alliance contributed to the colony's survival. Years later, a harvest celebration would become associated with what now we Americans know as Thanksgiving. The reality, however, was more complicated than the popular story often suggests. The relationship between settlers and native peoples was fragile and would eventually deteriorate into conflict. It wasn't all happy sunshine and rainbows if we all got together at a table. During the 1630s, thousands of English settlers crossed the Atlantic, known as the Great Migration. This movement dramatically increased the population of New England. Many settlers were Puritans, seeking to create communities built around their religious beliefs. They established towns, schools, and churches. Education became a priority. In 1636, settlers founded what would later become Harvard University. The colonies began developing distinct social and political identities. Local assemblies gave settlers a voice in government. Town meetings encouraged participation in civic life, and many ideas that would later influence American democracy were taking shape. The Dutch also established a foothold in North America. Their colony centered on New Amsterdam, located on Manhattan Island, what we know now as New York. As a major trading center, the colony attracted settlers from diverse backgrounds. Merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs helped create a thriving commercial hub. In 1664, English forces captured New Amsterdam without any significant resistance. The colony was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York. The city would eventually become one of the most important urban centers in the world. As the colonies grew, so did their demand for labor. Initially, many plantations relied on indentured servants. Over time, however, colonial leaders increasingly turned toward enslaved Africans. In 1619, the first recorded Africans arrived in English Virginia. What began as a relatively small institution expanded dramatically over the next century. Millions of Africans would eventually be transported across the Atlantic through the slave trade. Families were separated, cultures disrupted, and lives were forever altered. The labor of enslaved people became essential economies of the many colonies, particularly in the South. The institution generated immense wealth while creating a contradiction that would haunt America from its beginning. A society that increasingly valued liberty was simultaneously denying freedom to others. And that contradiction would eventually help drive the nation toward civil war. As European settlements expanded, conflicts became increasingly common. Native nations faced growing pressure on their lands. Competition for resources intensified. Violence erupted periodically across the colonies. One of the most devastating conflicts was King Philip's War in the 1670s. The war devastated communities throughout New England, and thousands died. And entire settlements had been destroyed. By its conclusion, the balance of power in the region had shifted dramatically toward the colonists. For Native people across North America, colonization represented a growing threat to their independence and way of life. Yet, resistance had continued. Tribes had formed better alliances, adapted to changing conditions, and fought to preserve their homelands. By the early 18th century, England's North America possessions had expanded into 13 colonies. Though united under British rule, each colony developed its own character. New England emphasized commerce, fishing, and shipbuilding. Then the middle colonies became centers of trade and diversity, and the southern colonies relied heavily on plantation agriculture, that's cotton, tobacco. Despite their differences, the colonies shared important experiences. They were separated from Britain by an ocean. They governed many local affairs themselves without the help of their mother country, and over time, they began to develop a unique identity. They were still British subjects. However, they were becoming something new, something distinct, something American, and something new, an idea. By 1750, the 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast. Their populations were growing, their economies had been thriving, their people were increasingly viewed themselves as different from those living in Britain, and this was a problem. Yet few imagined independence. Most colonists considered themselves loyal subjects of the British Crown, and that would soon change. A global war that would alter the relationship between Britain and its colonies forever, and the road toward revolution would begin. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain's North American colonies had become one of the most successful regions in the world. What began as a collection of fragile settlements clinging to the Atlantic coast had grown into thriving communities with bustling ports, productive farms, and rapidly expanding populations. Merchants in Boston traded across the Atlantic, and farmers in the Pennsylvania supplied grain throughout the colonies. Plantation owners in Virginia exported tobacco to Europe. Shipbuilders in New England constructed vessels that sailed around the world for many years to come. The colonies were prosperous, they were growing, and they were becoming increasingly confident. Yet, beneath that prosperity laid tensions that neither the colonists nor the British government fully understood. Within a generation, those tensions would explode into a full-scale revolution that would change the world and would influence other revolutions. The 13 colonies stretched more than 1,000 miles along the Atlantic coast. Each colony developed its own identity. In New England, rocky soil and cold winters encouraged commerce, fishing, and shipbuilding. Towns were centered around churches, schools, and local government. Literacy rates were among the highest in the world. If we look further south, the middle colonies became known for diversity in trade. People from England, Germany, Scotland, Ireland, and other parts of Europe settled there. Cities like Philadelphia and New York became important commercial centers. In the South, vast plantations produced tobacco, rice, and indigo with the help of slaves. These crops generated tremendous wealth. They depended heavily upon enslaved labor, and by the mid-1700s, slavery had become deeply embedded within the colonial economy. The contradiction between liberty and bondage existed from the beginning. Colonists often celebrated freedom for themselves while denying it to the others. It was a contradiction that would eventually threaten the survival of the nation itself at the brink of civil war. Though they remained loyal to Britain, many colonists were beginning to see themselves as something different. Most had never visited England. Many were born in America. The Atlantic Ocean separated them from London by weeks of travel. Colonial assemblies governed many local affairs. Over time, colonists developed a sense of independence. Not independence from Britain, not yet, but independence in thought. They increasingly believed they had rights as Englishmen, rights that could not be taken away. Rights that belonged to them regardless of where they lived. Those ideas would soon be tested. The spark came from a struggle over land. In the 1750s, both Britain and France claimed vast territories in North America. Many of those claims overlapped. The most disputed region was the Ohio River Valley. British settlers wanted to access the fertile farmland. French leaders hoped to connect their Canadian territories with settlements along the Mississippi River. Neither side was willing to back down, and in 1754, fighting erupted. The conflict would become known in America as the French and Indian War. It was a part of a larger global conflict called the 7 Years' War in Europe between Britain and France. For the first time, colonists across British North America fought together against a common enemy. Among them was a young Virginia officer named George Washington. Though inexperienced, Washington gained valuable military experience that would later prove critical. After years of fighting, Britain emerged victorious. France lost most of its North American possessions, and Britain now controlled enormous territories stretching across the continent. It seemed like a tremendous victory, but victory came at a price. The war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt. Protecting the newly acquired territory would require soldiers, forts, and money, and lots of money. British leaders believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense. Many colonists disagreed. For decades, Britain had largely allowed the colonies to govern themselves. Now London wanted greater control. The relationship between Britain and its colonies began to change, and that change would have consequences no one could fully foresee. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. And for the first time ever, Britain imposed a direct tax on its colonies. Printed materials, such as newspapers, licenses, legal documents, and playing cards, required official stamps. The tax itself was relatively small, but the principle behind it was not. Colonists argued they had no representatives in Parliament. If they had no voice in making laws, how could Parliament legally tax them? A phrase began appearing throughout the colonies: no taxation without representation. That slogan captured a growing frustration. Many colonists still consider themselves loyal subjects to the king. However, they increasingly believed their rights were being violated because they didn't have representatives in Parliament. And this led to protest and resistance. Opposition spread rapidly. Merchants organized boycotts, and crowds protested in the streets. Groups known as Sons of Liberty emerged and coordinated resistance. Among their leaders was Samuel Adams. British officials were often shocked by the intensity of colonial anger. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act because of the protests and resistance, but the underlying dispute remained unsolved. Who had the authority to govern the colonies without representation? Britain insisted Parliament possessed ultimate authority. Many colonists increasingly disagreed. Each new law widened the divide, and for years they were separated, and now they want control. Tensions reached a breaking point in Boston. British soldiers stationed in the city were deeply unpopular. Many residents viewed them as occupiers. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a confrontation erupted between soldiers and a crowd. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, and shots were fired. But no one knows who fired the first shots. 5 colonists were killed. News spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Patriot leaders described the event as a massacre. British officials argued the soldiers acted in self-defense. Regardless of interpretation, the incident became a powerful symbol. Many colonists began to fear the British rule threatened their liberties. In 1773, Parliament granted special privileges to the East India Company. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly in the colonies. Though tea became cheaper, many colonists viewed the law as another attempt to assert parliamentary authority, since they were only allowed to drink that tea. On a cold December night, protesters disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and boarded ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped hundreds of chests of tea into that water. This event had become known as the Boston Tea Party. It was one of the most dramatic acts of protest in American history. Britain responded with outrage. Determined to restore order, Parliament imposed harsh penalties. Boston Harbor was closed. Massachusetts lost many self-governing bodies and powers. British troops increased their presence, and colonists referred to these measures as the Intolerable Acts. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, Britain's actions united the colonies. For the first time, representatives from multiple colonies gathered to coordinate a response. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. Delegates hoped reconciliation remained possible, but events were moving toward confrontation. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts. Their mission was to seize colonial military supplies, guns, and ammo. Patriot riders spread the alarm. Among them was Paul Revere. At Lexington, colonial militia confronted British soldiers. No one knows who fired first, but a shot rang out. The American Revolution had begun, just like that. The conflict that followed would reshape not only North America, but the world. When fighting began in 1775, many colonists were not seeking independence. They wanted their rights restored. They hoped reconciliation remained possible. But as bloodshed increased, opinions had changed. The publication of a pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine helped accelerate that shift. In it, Paine argued the independence was not only possible, but necessary. The pamphlet became one of the most influential political writings in American history. Its message was simple. A distant island should not rule a continent. During the summer of 1776, delegates gathered in Philadelphia faced a monumental decision. Should they remain part of the British Empire? Or should they create something entirely new? A committee led by Thomas Jefferson drafted a declaration explaining their reasoning. The document contained words that would echo across centuries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. The colonies had become the United States of America. The decision was revolutionary. Kings claimed authority through birth and tradition. The Declaration of Independence claimed governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed, the people. It was one of the history's most radical political statements. Declaring independence was easier than winning it. When they declared independence, they were still fighting the war. The British Empire possessed the world's most powerful military, and the colonies were not it. Many expected the rebellion to fail quickly. American forces suffered repeated defeats after defeats. New York fell to the British. The Continental Army retreated, and morale had collapsed. Some soldiers deserted it. Others lacked shoes, food, or proper clothing. At times, the revolution appeared doomed. Yet, George Washington refused to surrender. His leadership became one of the defining factors in the survival of the American cause in the American Revolution. On Christmas night in 1776, Washington made a bold decision. His army crossed the icy Delaware River during a snowstorm. The operation was dangerous. Many people believed that it was impossible, and at dawn, American forces surprised the Hessian troops at Trenton. The victory was small in military terms, but its physiological impact was enormous. The revolution was still very much alive, and hope had returned along with morale. And the winning at Trenton led us to winning at Saratoga, which changed the war dramatically in 1777. British leaders attempted to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. Instead, they suffered a major defeat at Saratoga. The victory convinced France that the American cause had a chance of success. And to support them, French support transformed the war with money, with weapons, and even with troops, and eventually later in the war, naval power. Without France, American independence might never have been achieved. The winter of 1777 and 1778 tested the Continental Army more than any battlefield has ever tested them. At Valley Forge, soldiers endured hunger, cold, and disease. Thousands had suffered and had fallen dead. Yet, the army survived, and it continued fighting. Training programs led by Baron von Steuben transformed inexperienced volunteers into a more disciplined fighting force. It looked like an actual army. The hardships of Valley Forge became a symbol of perseverance and sacrifice. By 1781, the war was entering its final stage. British General Cornwallis established a position at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington saw an opportunity. American and French forces moved south. Meanwhile, the French Navy blocked British reinforcements. Cornwallis was trapped and nowhere to turn. After weeks of siege operations, he had surrendered. The victory effectively ended major fighting. The revolution had succeeded, but the beginning had just begun. In 1783, Britain formally recognized American independence. The United States had achieved what many considered the impossible. A collection of colonies that were not really fully united at the beginning had defeated one of the most powerful empires in the world. Yet, victory created new challenges. The new nation was free, but how would govern them? How would they govern themselves would be the next question. How could 13 states, separate states, become one country? How could liberty survive without descending into chaos? The answers to those questions would shape the next chapter of American history and until the next millennium. The Revolutionary War was only the beginning. The United States had secured its independence, but independence alone did not guarantee its survival.
The new nation faced enormous challenges. Its economy was weak and in debt. Its government was fragile. Its future was uncertain. And many observers around the world expected the American experiment to fail. His history offered few examples of a republic surviving for long periods of time, most falling before 200 years, most eventually collapsed into chaos or dictatorship. It would not survive 250 years of the United States. How would the United States be any different? The answer would depend upon choices made during the nation's first few years.
A bit worried. America's first government operated under the Articles of Confederation. Created during the Revolution, the Articles intentionally limited the power of the national government. Many Americans feared centralized authority. After all, they had just fought a war against what they viewed as an government overreach and tyrannical government. Under the Articles, most power remained with the states. Congress could conduct diplomacy and declare war, but it could not effectively raise taxes. It cannot regulate interstate commerce. And it often struggled to enforce its decisions. At first, these weaknesses seemed manageable, but the red flags became more red over time. They became impossible to ignore, and as the Gen Z say, the saxophones became louder. The warning sign came in the western Massachusetts. Many farmers faced heavy debts following the Revolutionary War. Economic hardships spread throughout rural communities. In 1786, a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays led an uprising against state authorities, trying to foreclose properties. The rebels attempted to shut down courts and prevent further property foreclosures. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it did take a while. It alarmed national leaders. If government could not easily maintain order, could the republic survive? For men like George Washington, the answer was clear, that the Articles of Confederation needed to be fixed. The nation needed a stronger government. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they decided to scrap it and create an entirely new system. The Constitutional Convention became one of the most important meetings in American history. Inside Independence Hall, delegates debated nearly every aspect of government. How much power should the federal government have? How much power should the states have? How should states be represented? How could liberty be protected while maintaining stability? Compromise became essential. Large states and small states found common ground. They had to. Different regional interests reached agreements. And these results was a remarkable document, the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution created a government unlike any the world had seen before. Power would be divided among three branches. Congress would make laws, and the president would enforce those laws. The courts would interpret those laws. Each branch would check on the other branches. No individual or no institution would possess unlimited authority. The system was designed to prevent tyranny while preserving liberty. Yet, not everyone supported it. Many feared that the new government would become too powerful. Their concerns led to the Constitution's most important additions: Bill of Rights. Ratified in 1791, these first 10 amendments guaranteed essential freedoms. Freedoms like speech, religion, freedom of the press to report on the happenings of the government, the right to bear arms, possess guns, protection against unreasonable searches, and other rights Americans continue to debate and defend today. In 1789, the nation elected its first president. There was little debate about who should hold the office. In fact, there was no popular vote. George Washington was the obvious choice. His leadership during the Revolution had earned widespread respect. Many Americans trusted him more than anyone else. Washington understood that every decision he would make would establish precedents. His administration helped stabilize the government. It established credibility both at home and abroad. But most importantly, Washington demonstrated that power could be voluntarily surrendered. After 2 terms, he had stepped down. In doing so, he reinforced a principle that would shape American democracy for generations. No one was above the Republic. Despite the shared revolutionary experience, American leaders disagreed about the nation's future. 2 figures came to embody those disagreements: Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, on one hand, envisioned a strong national government. He supported manufacturing, banking, and closer ties with Britain. Jefferson favored agricultural communities and stronger state governments. He feared concentrated power. The rivalry helped create America's first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. As the 18th century came to an end, the United States remained a small nation along the Atlantic coast. Few could imagine how dramatically it would grow during the next century. The Republic had survived its infancy. Now it would begin expanding across an entire continent. By 1800s, Americans increasingly looked westward. Beyond the Mississippi River stretched an enormous territory controlled by France. President Thomas Jefferson recognized both the opportunity and the danger. If a powerful European nation controlled the Mississippi River, America's growth could be limited. Then, an unexpected opportunity had appeared. Napoleon Bonaparte needed money. Rather than merely selling New Orleans, France offered the entire Louisiana territory after negotiations. Jefferson was stunned, and only for $15 million, the United States acquired more than 800,000 square miles of land. The purchase doubled the nation's size overnight, and it remains one of the greatest land acquisitions in history. Jefferson wanted to understand what the nation had just purchased. In 1804, he dispatched an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was simple: explore the territory and map the land while they're at it, establish relations with native nations, and find a route to the Pacific Ocean. The expedition lasted more than 2 years. Members crossed mountains, rivers, forests, and plains. They encountered dozens of indigenous communities. One of those most important figures in the journey was Sacagawea, a Shannon woman whose knowledge and diplomacy helped ensure the expedition's success. Lewis and Clark returned with valuable information about the American West. The report fueled dreams of expansion. The United States continued to expand. New states joined the Union. Settlers crossed the Appalachian Mountains, and farmers established communities across the frontier. But expansion created conflict and created more problems. Native nations resisted the loss of their homelands. European powers continued to influence North American affairs. and tensions between the United States and Britain began to rise once again. In 1812, relations with Britain had deteriorated. British warships interfered with American trade. American sailors were impressed into British service, forced into service. Many Americans believed Britain was encouraging native resistance on the frontier. Congress had declared war. The conflict that followed is often called America's Second War of Independence. At first, the war went poorly. American invasions of Canada failed. British forces launched successful counterattacks. In 1814, they captured Washington, D.C., and burned the White House down. Government officials fled. The capital was damaged too. The nation's future once again seemed uncertain. During the British attack on Baltimore, an American lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment of Fort McHenry. Throughout the night, explosions illuminated the sky. When dawn arrived, the American flag was still flying above the fort. Inspired by what he saw, Key wrote a poem that later became the Star-Spangled Banner, our country's anthem, a symbol of perseverance during the nation's most difficult moments. Ironically, one of the war's most famous battles occurred after peace had already been negotiated. In January of 1815, American forces led by Andrew Jackson, the future president, defeated the British at New Orleans. The victory made Jackson a national hero. Although it had little impact on the treaty itself, the battle gave Americans a renewed sense of confidence. The nation had survived another major conflict. National pride had surged once again. The United States increasingly viewed itself as a permanent and independent power. The decades following the War of 1812 would transform the country. Population growth exploded, and territories expanded, industry developed, and Americans became convinced that their nation's future lay in the West. That belief would reshape the continent itself. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States. Unlike many earlier leaders, Jackson presented himself as a champion of an ordinary Americans. He had been born into modest circumstances, and he was a military hero. He was loved, and he spoke directly to popular concerns. Many of his supporters viewed his election as a triumph for democracy. More white men than ever before participated in politics. Property requirements for voting disappeared in many states. Political precipitation expanded dramatically. Yet, Jackson's presidency remained deeply controversial. His policies reflected both the promise and contradictions of the American democracy and freedom. As settlers moved westward, pressure grew to acquire native lands. Jackson supported relocation. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This law authorized the forced relocation of native nations living east of the Mississippi River. Many tribes resisted. Some fought in court, others negotiated. Ultimately, thousands were removed from their ancestral homelands. Among the most tragic episodes was the removal of the Cherokee Nation. Families were forced to travel hundreds of miles west. Disease, hunger, and exposure claimed thousands of lives. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears. For Native peoples, westward expansion often meant disposition and suffering. By the 1840s, many Americans embraced a powerful idea: manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. Supporters viewed an expansion as both inevitable and beneficial. Critics warned it would increase conflict and deepen division over slavery. Despite the debate, expansion continued. Pioneers traveled west along trails stretching thousands of miles. Families risked everything for new opportunities. Entire communities uprooted themselves in pursuit of a better future. One of the most significant developments occurred in Texas. Originally part of Mexico, Texas attracted increasing numbers of American settlers. Tensions grew between settlers and the Mexican government. In 1836, Texas declared independence. The conflict produced legendary moments, including the Battle of the Alamo. Though the defenders were defeated, their sacrifice became a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo. Texas eventually became an independent republic. Nearly a decade later, it joined the United States. Its annexation would help trigger another war. In 1846, war erupted between the United States and Mexico. American forces advanced rapidly, and victories followed across multiple fronts. By 1848, Mexico agreed to a treaty ending the conflict. The United States acquired vast territories including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and portions of several other states. America now stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. The continental nation, envisioned by generations of leaders, had become reality. But expansion created a dangerous question. Would slavery expand into these new territories? The answer would divide the nation. By mid-century, Americans celebrated unprecedented growth. Railroads had connected distant regions, cities had expanded, and industry was accelerating. Immigration had increased. Yet, beneath the optimism, tensions intensified. North and South increasingly disagreed about economics, politics, and slavery. Compromises became more and more difficult, and trust eroded away. The issues many had hoped to avoid could no longer be postponed. The future of slavery, and with it, the future of the Union itself. By the 1850s, the United States had achieved what earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The nation stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Its population was growing rapidly. Its economy was expanding, and its cities were becoming centers of commerce and industry. To many observers, America's future appeared limitless. Yet, beneath the surface, the country was coming apart. The question that had haunted the nation since its founding could no longer be avoided. Could a country founded on liberty continue to tolerate slavery? And if it could not, would the Union survive? For decades, American leaders had attempted to avoid confrontation over slavery. Compromises temporarily eased tensions. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each proposed a reckoning. None solved the actual problem. As new territories entered the Union, Americans argued over whether slavery would expand westward. Southern leaders believed that slavery was essential to their economy and was a way of life. Many Northerners increasingly viewed slavery as morally wrong and incompatible with the nation's founding ideas. The divide grew wider and wider with each passing year. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers to decide whether slavery would exist in their territories. Supporters called it popular sovereignty. Critics warned it would lead to violence. They were correct. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas. Election fraud became common. Armed groups attacked one another. and entire communities lived in fear now.
Newspapers referred to the territory as Bleeding Kansas. The violence offered a preview of what awaited the nation. Americans were increasingly willing to kill one another over slavery.
In this growing crisis, a relatively unknown politician from Illinois emerged onto the national stage. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln believed slavery should not expand into new territories. By 1858, during a Senate campaign, he delivered a warning. Quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," end quote. The nation, he argued, could not permanently remain half slave and half free. His words resonated across the North. In the South, they generated an alarm. Many Southern leaders feared that Lincoln's vision threatened their future. When Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860, Southern states faced a choice: accept his leadership or leave the Union. Beginning with South Carolina, states voted to succeed. One by one, they departed, and eventually 11 states formed the Confederate States of America. They believed they were protecting their rights and institutions. The federal government believed secession was illegal. Both sides prepared for conflict. The first shots of the Civil War were fired on April 12, 1861. Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The bombardment lasted more than 30 hours. When the fort surrendered, the nation was at war. What many expected to be a short conflict became the deadliest war in American history. Families had become divided, and communities were torn apart. Brother fought against brother. The future of the United States hung in the balance. The Union possessed significant advantages. It had a larger population, more factories, and greater financial resources, which is great for war. Yet victory was far from guaranteed to the Union. Confederate soldiers fought fiercely, and many Southern generals proved exponentially skilled. Among them was Robert E. Lee. For much of the war, Confederate armies repeatedly outperformed expectations. The conflict became a brutal test of endurance. New technologies increased the war's lethality. Railroaders transported troops rapidly, and telegraphs improved communication. The industrial production sustained the armies, but on the battlefield, soldiers still fought largely in traditional formations. The result was devastating. Casualties mounted on a scale few had imagined. As the war continued, Lincoln's goals evolved. Initially, preserving the Union remained his primary objective. But as the war went on, he concluded that ending slavery was necessary to save the nation. And on January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territories to be free. Though it did not immediately end slavery everywhere, it transformed the character of the war. The conflict was now about both union and freedom. It also allowed African Americans to join the Union military. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would ultimately serve. Their contributions proved essential to Union victory. By July of 1863, the war reached a turning point. Lee invaded the North, hoping to achieve a decisive victory on Union soil. The two armies collided near the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, fierce fighting raged. The battle produced staggering casualties. More than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. When it ended, Lee's army had retreated. The Confederacy would never again mount a major invasion of the North. Months later, Lincoln returned to Gettysburg. Standing among the graves of the fallen soldiers, he delivered one of the most famous speeches in history. In just a few minutes, he redefined the purpose of the war. The struggle, he said, was about ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
And a while ago, I actually recorded the full Gettysburg Address and posted it on my social media. So here is me reading the full Gettysburg Address.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, convinced in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so convinced and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who have here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot concentrate, we cannot hollow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have concentrated far above our poor power to add or to subtract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task of remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. And by 1864, Union forces steadily gained momentum. General Ulysses S. Grant coordinated campaigns across multiple fronts. General William Sherman marched through Georgia, targeting the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Cities fell and crumbled. Railroads were destroyed, and without railroads, you couldn't move resources, and those resources dwindled. In April of 1865, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was effectively over. The Union had survived, but barely. Slavery had been destroyed, but the cost was staggering. Approximately 620,000 to 750,000 Americans died. Entire regions lay devastated. The nation faced a difficult question. How could it rebuild? And rebuild came at a cost. And it took a lot of time. Just days after the Confederate surrender, tragedy struck. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. There, he was shot by actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln died the following morning. Millions mourned his death, and the nation had lost the leader many believed was best equipped to guide reconciliation. His death altered the course of Reconstruction. The Civil War had ended slavery. Now, the nation faced the challenge of defining freedom for once and for all. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment protected voting rights for black men. Together, these amendments transformed the Constitution. For a brief period, Reconstruction offered hope. African Americans established schools, businesses, churches, and political organizations. Black voters participated in elections. And black legislators served in local, state, and federal governments. Communities worked to build new lives after generations of bondage. It was one of the most significant expansions of democracy in American history. Yet, progress faced fierce resistance. Many white Southerners opposed Reconstruction. Violence became widespread. Groups such as the Ku Klux Klan used intimidation and terror to undermine political participation. Federal troops attempted to maintain order, but support for Reconstruction gradually weakened. Economic concerns shifted national attention elsewhere. Political compromises reduced federal involvement, and by 1877, Reconstruction effectively ended. Many of its gains were rolled back. The struggle for civil rights would continue for another century. While political battles continued, America's economy underwent extraordinary change. Factories had multiplied and railroads expanded. Cities exploded in size once again. The United States entered an era known as the Gilded Age. This term suggested something covered in gold on the surface but troubled underneath. It was a time of remarkable opportunity and profound inequality. Nothing transformed America more than the railroad. Tracks connected distant regions, goods moved faster than ever before, and farmers reached new markets, new opportunities. Businesses expanded nationally. In 1869, the completion of the first transcontinental railroad linked the east and west coast. Travel that once that took months could now be completed in a few short days. The nation felt smaller, but more connected, more unified. Industrialization created enormous fortunes. Entrepreneurs built businesses on an unprecedented scale. Andrew Carnegie dominated steel production. John D. Rockefeller built a powerful oil empire, and J.P. Morgan shaped the nation's financial system, J.P. Morgan and Chase. Supporters viewed these men as innovators who fueled economic growth. Critics accused them of monopolistic practices and excessive power. The debate over wealth and influence remains familiar today. Industrial growth attracted millions of immigrants. They arrived from Ireland, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe and beyond. Many passed through Ellis Island, where the Statue of Liberty is. They came seeking opportunity, jobs, freedom, a better way of life. For many, America delivered possibilities unavailable elsewhere. For others, life remained difficult. Workers often endured dangerous conditions, low wages, and long hours. But yet, they continued to build the nation. Factories, bridges, more railroads, more cities. Their labor helped shape modern America. As the 19th century grew to a close, the United States had been transformed. A nation once confined to the Atlantic coast now stretched across a continent. A rural republic became an industrial giant. Millions of immigrants had arrived, and new technologies were changing everyday life. The United States was no longer an experiment, struggling to survive. It was becoming a world power, and the 20th century would test that power in ways no one could yet imagine. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the United States stood at a crossroads once again. The nation had become an industrial powerhouse. Its factories produced steel, oil, machinery, and consumer goods on a scale unimaginable just decades earlier. Cities continued to grow rapidly. Skyscrapers climbed into the sky. New inventions transformed daily life. Yet beneath the progress were serious problems. Political corruption, unsafe working conditions like child labor, and poverty, with growing inequality. Many Americans believed the nation needed a reform. The progressive era had begun. Progressives came from many backgrounds. Journalists exposed corruption, activists fought for safer workplaces, and politicians challenged powerful corporations, and citizens demanded a more responsive government. One of the most influential reformers was President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt believed government should act as a referee between corporations and the public. He challenged monopolies, strengthened consumer protections, and promoted conservation. Under his leadership, millions of acres of forest and public lands were preserved. His energetic style made him one of the most popular presidents in American history. One of the most significant movements of the era focused on voting rights. For decades, women had campaigned for political equality. Leaders such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady sat and argued that democracy could not be complete while half the population lacked the right to vote. The struggle lasted generations. Finally, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. Women across the United States gained the constitutional right to vote. It was one of the most important expansions of American democracy. While Americans pursued reform at home, Europe drifted toward a catastrophe. In 1914, World War I erupted. Major powers mobilized millions of soldiers. New technologies turned battlefields into killing fields, with machine guns, poison gas, heavy artillery, and trench warfare. At first, the United States remained neutral. Many Americans hoped to avoid involvement in another European conflict. But events gradually changed public opinion. German submarine attacked targeted ships crossing the Atlantic. The infamous Zimmermann telegram revealed German attempts to encourage Mexico to attack the United States. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson had asked Congress for a declaration of war. America entered the conflict. Millions of Americans served during World War I. Fresh American troops arrived in Europe just as Allied forces desperately needed reinforcements. The arrival of American soldiers boosted morale and strengthened Allied resistance. In November of 1918, the fighting ended. The war had claimed millions of lives, and entire regions of Europe lay devastated. The United States emerged from the conflict with increased global influence. Yet, many Americans remained wary of foreign entanglements. The nation would soon turn inward, and for a brief period, prosperity seemed limitless. The 1920s became known as the Roaring '20s. The economy had expanded rapidly. Automobiles transformed transportation. Radio connected Americans across vast distances. Movies became a dominant form of entertainment. Consumer culture flourished. No individual symbolized this era more than Henry Ford. Ford's assembly line revolutionized manufacturing. Mass production made products more affordable and faster. Millions of Americans experienced rising living standards. It seemed as though prosperity would continue forever. But appearances can be deceiving. Throughout the decade, speculation increased dramatically. Many Americans invested heavily in the stock market. Some borrowed money to buy stocks. Others believed prices could only rise. Then came October 1929. The market collapsed, and panic spread. Fortunes disappeared. Businesses failed. Banks closed their doors. The American economy entered a crisis unlike anything it had experienced before. The Great Depression affected nearly every aspect of American life. Millions lost their jobs. Families lost their homes. Farmers faced declining prices and environmental disaster. Bread lines stretched through city streets. Shanty towns appeared across the nation. And for many Americans, survival became a daily challenge. The crisis shook confidence in institutions and leaders. People searched for answers. and in 1932 they elected a president who promised action. Franklin D. Roosevelt entered office during one of the darkest moments in American history. His message was pretty simple. The nation would not surrender to despair. Through a series of programs known as the New Deal, Roosevelt expanded the federal government's role in economic recovery. Public works projects created jobs, financial reform stabilized the banks, and programs provided assistance to struggling families. The Depression did not disappear overnight, but Roosevelt restored confidence and hope to the American people. His leadership would soon be tested by an even greater challenge, a world war, once again. Even as Americans struggled through the Depression, dangerous forces were rising overseas. In Germany, Adolf Hitler expanded Nazi power. In Italy, Mussolini pursued imperial ambitions. Japan sought dominance in Asia, and by 1939, World War II had begun. Once again, many Americans hoped to remain neutral, and they did for a while. The memories of World War I were still fresh, yet global events increasingly made neutrality impossible. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base on Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned, aircrafts were destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed on homeland. The attack shook the nation to its core. The following day, Roosevelt addressed Congress. He described December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. The United States entered World War II. America mobilized on a scale never before seen. Factories converted to wartime production. Automobile plants built tanks and aircrafts. Shipyards launched vessels at astonishing rates. Millions of men joined the military. Women entered industrial jobs in unprecedented numbers to take the place of men that were at war. The image of Rosie the Retriever became a symbol of wartime service. The nation's industrial strength became one of the greatest weapons. American forces fought alongside allied nations across Europe. They landed in North Africa, advanced through Italy, and prepared for one of history's most important military operations. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched the Normandy landings. Thousands of soldiers stormed beaches under heavy fire. The invasion established a foothold in Western Europe. It marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's final defeat. Less than a year later, Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead, and the European War was finally over. Fighting in the Pacific proved equally intense. American forces advanced island by island toward Japan. Battles at Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa became legendary. Casualties mounted, though. Military planners feared an invasion of Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered shortly afterward. World War II had ended. The conflict claimed more than 60 million lives worldwide. The United States emerged victorious. But forever. The world had changed forever. When the war ended, much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. The United States did not, however. Its economy was booming. Its military was unmatched, and its global influence had never been greater. America had become a superpower. The next challenge would come not from Nazi Germany, but from a former ally, the Soviet Union. The alliance that defeated Hitler quickly unraveled. The United States and the Soviet Union represented competing visions of the future. One promoted democratic capitalism, the other promoted communist rule. Neither side trusted the other. A new conflict emerged, this time without firing a single thing. This was not a direct war between superpowers, but a global struggle for influence, the Cold War. The development of nuclear weapons had changed everything. For the first time in human history, nations possessed the ability to destroy entire cities within moments. Both superpowers built enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons, and fear of nuclear war shaped everyday lives. Students practiced duck and cover drills. Families built fallout shelters, stocked up on food. Political leaders carefully managed crises to avoid catastrophe. The world lived under the shadow of mutually assured destruction. The Cold War influenced conflicts around the globe. American forces fought in Korea. Later, the United States became deeply involved in the Vietnam War. Both wars reflected broader efforts to contain the spread of communism. The Vietnam War proved practically divisive. Television brought images of combat directly into American homes like never before. Public protests grew. Trust in the government declined. The war left lasting scars on the nation. Competition extended beyond Earth itself during the Cold War. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, Americans were stunned. The world's first artificial satellite signaled Soviet technological advancement. The United States responded with massive investments in science, education, and space exploration. The rivalry culminated in one of humanity's greatest achievements. In July of 1969, the Apollo 11 moon landing carried astronauts to the moon. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, he spoke words remembered around the world.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The achievement represented more than scientific success. It symbolized American determination, innovation, and ambition. For decades, the Cold War shaped international affairs. Then, unexpectedly, the Soviet system began to weaken. Economic struggles mounted, political reforms accelerated change. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall became a powerful symbol of transformation. 2 years later, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War was over. The United States stood as the world's sole superpower. Yet new challenges were already emerging again, and America itself was changing. The United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful nation on earth. Its economy was booming, its military was unmatched, and its influence reached every corner of the globe. Yet, for millions of Americans, freedom remained incomplete. While the nation championed democracy abroad, segregation and discrimination persisted at home. The struggle to fulfill the promises of a Declaration of Independence was far from over. A new generation would challenge America to live up to its ideals. Nearly a century after the Civil War, many African Americans still face systematic discrimination. In much of the South, segregation governed everyday life. Separate schools, separate restaurants, separate transportation systems, separate drinking fountains. Voting restrictions prevented many Black Americans from participating in elections. The system was enforced not only through law, but often through intimidation and violence. Many Americans accepted segregation as normal. Others increasingly challenged it. The legal battle against segregation gained momentum during the 1950s. In 1954, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education. The court ruled that segregated public schools were inherently unequal. The decision overturned decades of legal precedent. For civil rights advocates, it was a major victory. For opponents of integration, it became a rally point. The nation found itself confronting difficult questions about inequality and justice. In December of 1955, a quiet act of resistance helped ignite a movement. Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. For more than a year, African Americans refused to use the city's buses. The boycott demonstrated the power of organized, nonviolent protest. It also introduced many Americans to a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. King's leadership would have defined the movement. Throughout the 1960s, civil rights activists organized protests, sit-ins, voter registration drives, and demonstrations. Many faced arrests. Some endured violence, while others sacrificed their lives. Despite the risks, momentum continued to grow. In 1963, hundreds of thousands have gathered in Washington, D.C. Standing before the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered one of history's most famous speeches, "I Have a Dream." His words challenged America to fulfill its founding promises. The speech became one of the defining moments of the 20th century. The civil rights movement achieved significant victories. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in public accommodations in employment. The Voting Rights Act, 1965, protected voting rights throughout the country. These laws transformed American society. Yet the struggle for equality did not end. Questions involving race, opportunity, justice, and representation would continue to shape the nation for decades to come. The movement demonstrated something fundamental about American history. Progress often comes through the determination of ordinary citizens willing to challenge the status quo. The final decades of the 20th century brought extraordinary change. Technology was transformed communication. Globalization reshaped economies. Social movements expanded opportunities for many Americans. The nation became increasingly diverse. At the same time, the political disagreements grew more intense. Americans often disagreed about the role of government, economic policy, foreign affairs, and cultural values. Yet, innovation continued to drive the nation forward. Perhaps no development changed daily life more than the rise of computers and the internet. What began as specialized technology became a central part of modern life. Businesses transformed, communication accelerated, and information became available at unprecedented speed. Companies founded in garages grew into global giants. The digital revolution connected billions of people around the world. It also created new challenges involving privacy, misinformation, and cybersecurity. America once again found itself navigating the opportunities and risks of rapid technological change. On September 11, 2001, the nation experienced one of the most traumatic days in its history. Terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airliners. 2 struck the towers of the World Trade Center.
It's 8:52 here in New York. I'm Bryant Gumbel. We understand that there has been a plane crash on the southern tip of Manhattan. You're looking at the World Trade Center. We understand that a plane. So you have no idea right now?
There's another plane just hit. Right, oh my God, another plane has just hit. It hit another building, flew right into the middle of it.
Another hit the Pentagon. A 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The attacks shocked the world. Americans responded with grief, unity, and determination.
As we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens, I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The events of September 11th reshaped foreign policy and national security for decades. Wars followed in Afghanistan and Iraq.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
Debates over security and liberty intensified. The nation entered a new era. The 20th century brought both prosperity and hardship. The financial crisis of 2008 triggered the most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression.
After bailing out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac the week before and Bear Stearns the previous March, the federal government decided not to rescue Lehman. That decision set off a chain of events which nearly brought the world financial system to a halt. A few days later, insurance giant AIG nearly collapsed and had to be rescued. Credit locked up around the world, and financial markets tanked, deepening a recession that had begun 10 months earlier. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson went to Congress to ask for a $700 billion bailout for the nation's banks.
Millions lost jobs and homes. Businesses had struggled. Communities faced uncertainty. Yet, the economy eventually recovered. New industries emerged. Entrepreneurship flourished. And America continued adapting to changing circumstances. And in 2020, another challenge emerged. The COVID-19 pandemic affected nearly every aspect of the daily life.
Now to growing concerns about the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S. Here's what we know. A Washington state resident fell ill after returning from Wuhan, China, where the outbreak began. Officials now say more than 400 people have been sickened and 9 people have died.
Schools had closed, businesses had to adapt, healthcare systems faced extraordinary pressure, and families experienced loss and uncertainty. The pandemic highlighted both the strengths and vulnerabilities of modern society. It also demonstrated the resilience of communities working together during difficult times. Throughout its history, America has often been divided. The 20th century proved no exception. Political disagreements intensified. Social media amplified competing viewpoints, and public debates became increasingly visible.
Video from outside the Capitol shows the beginning of the storm on the Capitol between protesters and police. Police have not said if any arrests have been made.
Tonight, an ABC News special report, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, a dark new turn for a deeply divided nation.
It is my great dishonor to be the person that says this and breaks this to you on television, but President Donald Trump is announcing on Truth Social, the great and even legendary Charlie Kirk is dead. No one understood or had the heart of the youth in the United States of America better than Charlie.
Yet, disagreement itself has always been part of the American story. From the Constitutional Convention to the present day, Americans have argued about the nation's direction. The challenge has never been avoiding disagreement, but the challenge has been finding ways to move forward despite it. At its challenges, the United States remains a center of innovation. American scientists, entrepreneurs, engineers, artists, and educators continue shaping the future. New breakthroughs in medicine, artificial intelligence, energy, and space exploration promise to transform the world once again. The story of America remains unfinished, and the next chapter is already being written. 250 years, from 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast to a nation spanning a continent. From a fragile republic to a global superpower. From candlelit streets to spacecraft exploring distant worlds. Few nations have ever experienced such dramatic transformation in such a short period of time. America's story is not one of uninterrupted progress, nor is it one of unbroken failure. It is a story of ideas tested by reality, a story of conflict and reconciliation, a story of people striving to create something better than what came before. In 1776, the founders launched an experiment. Could a people govern themselves? Could liberty survive without a king? And could a republic endure? The answers were never guaranteed. The nation faced revolution after revolution, civil war, economic depression, world wars, social upheaval, and countless other challenges. Yet, the experiment survived and continues to this day, not because Americans always agreed, but because generations continued believing the experiment was worth preserving and worth fighting for. America's history does not belong solely to presidents and generals. It belongs to farmers who worked the land, immigrants who crossed oceans, workers who built railroads and factories, teachers who educated future generations, and scientists who expanded human knowledge, with activists who fought for justice, and soldiers who served in times of war, protecting our homeland, parents who sacrificed for their children. The story of America is ultimately the story of its people, millions of individual lives woven together across 2.5 centuries. And it's not done. As the United States celebrates its 250th anniversary on July 4th, 2026, the nation stands where every generation has stood, looking backward while looking forward. The challenges facing America today are different from those faced in 1776. But the fundamental questions remain familiar. How can liberty be protected? How can opportunity be expanded? And how can citizens with different views continue to govern themselves peacefully? Each generation must answer those questions anew. The founders could not have imagined skyscrapers, airplanes, the internet, or humans walking on the moon. They could not have foreseen a nation of more than 340 million people representing every corner of the globe. They could not have predicted every triumph or every downfall, every failure. Yet, they left behind an idea, the belief that people possess certain rights, that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, and that freedom is worth defending. For 250 years, Americans have debated what those ideas mean. The debate continues today, and it will continue tomorrow, because America is not a finished project. It never has been. It's a work in progress, an experiment, a promise, a story still being written. As fireworks illuminate the sky on 4th of July 2026, Americans will celebrate not only a nation born in 1776, they'll celebrate 250 years of perseverance, sacrifice, innovation, and hope. And somewhere in the future, generations yet unborn will look back on this moment and decide what kind of chapter comes next. The first 250 years are complete. The next 250 years begins now. What will our nation look like in 250 years?